Okay, so our guest today is Paul Biggar. He's a tech entrepreneur who, following Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza, turned his attention to the Palestinian struggle. He's since set up a platform called Tech for Palestine that brings together a coalition of experts in the digital space to further the cause of Palestinian liberation. And that includes a lot of the apps which activists like me, like others in BDS, Belfast, and other groups around the world would use every day. So Boycott, News Cord, Accountable Media. So it's great to speak to him today. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks so much for having me.
Good. So you grew up in Ireland, didn't you? And had your education here before moving into tech.
Yeah, for the most part. I was born in Ireland. My dad was a diplomat, so he moved around a bit when we were young. He was an Irish diplomat, and so we were in Switzerland, we were in New York. But yeah, for the most part, I was in Ireland until I was about 30.
Yeah. And then you got into tech, moved to Silicon Valley, and had a bit of
Yeah,
success there. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So I went to Trinity and did computer science and did my PhD. And when I was finished, I was like, all right, tech is exciting and you got to be in San Francisco for it. So yeah, packed up and headed off to San Francisco, and I was there about 9 years.
Yeah. And what was the kind of project you were doing? What was it that succeeded there?
Um, so the time I went to San Francisco, it was 2011, and it was what we now sort of recognize as the start of this sort of boom cycle for tech that went from about 2021 or 2010 or so to 2021. And so it was the time where, like, almost every sort of second generation product got built. And what we were building was a tool for developers. It was called CircleCI, and it's the way that software engineers, it sort of like automates their workflow for how they get code from their computers into their to their customers.
Right. And then there was a big shift in your life, I think, after October the 7th, after Israel started its genocide in Gaza. I read your blog post in, I think, December of that year, where you were sort of expressing your horror about what was going on. Um, I thought it was interesting how you characterized, when we were speaking before the interview, how you characterized it less as a political decision, because you said you weren't particularly political. It was more a
Hmm.
humanitarian cause, and I've heard Palestine Action make that point recently as well. This isn't people shouldn't necessarily think of this as political. It's simply humanitarianism to get involved in this.
Yeah, I mean I think learning about the history of Palestine is a sort of a changing, well, actually, really the history of Israel, because Palestine's been here for a long, long time. But learning that basically the last 75 years has been massacre after massacre, occupation, settlements, and how little of their own country Palestine controls, and then how Israel has been able to engineer that, in particular with the support of the US. It's I mean, obviously it's reminiscent of our own Irish history, but also it just sort of like breaks your brain a little bit. It's like difficult to understand, right? This country doesn't control its own electricity, its own water, its own port, its own airspace. Like, that makes no sense. And it sort of adds up with the genocide that we're seeing. There's How is this enabled to happen? Well, it's the same way that all the other things before it have been enabled to happen. So you get very quickly from a humanitarian situation to, let's have a look at the root cause of this, and then you start reading about the Nakba, and you start reading about APAC, or the ADL, or the Israel lobby in the US, and it's like, things start to add up pretty quickly.
Hmm. I suppose that mean ultimately everything's political in some sense, and that you have to be
Right, right.
involved in
I
a
mean,
political solution for it. Yeah.
yeah, our whole lives are political. So everything, whether it's homelessness or simple human rights for people in our societies. I mean, that's all political, really.
Mm. I mean, I think that the Palestinian one is so striking that you could view it just purely in humanitarian terms, in the same way that just somebody being starving or being attacked is
Hmm.
is just
Right. I mean,
emerging culture. Yeah,
it's
yeah,
like
yeah.
people, you see this in media. It's like, oh, Palestinian children are starving, and it
Mm,
makes you think that like that, perhaps there's something wrong with the Palestinian economy, but it's no, it's aid is blocked by Israel, by soldiers who shoot children in the head, who bomb aid centers, who specifically banned all of the aid that was getting in, and who are deliberately starving Palestinians, and but you phrase it as just like, oh, it's this terrible humanitarian problem. There's a famine in Gaza, like they're
mm.
30 miles from endless food.
It's of course, a man-made famine. It's not. Sometimes
Yeah,
the media portrays it as just a tragedy or just something that seems to have happened. They use the passive
right.
voice again and
And the
again, but
tragedy is humanitarian, right? But the
mm,
actual thing behind it is that it is a man-made famine, and it is deliberately being done, and that's I suppose a lot more political.
yeah. Um, and then I was sort of struck, sort of in that same post, what you did was quite unusual, or at least I haven't really seen it before. Is that you called out a lot of people who you felt were letting people down, and people who you'd worked with, investors and so
Hmm.
on. I mean, probably almost everybody had that sense after October the 7th of seeing people in a different way or seeing the world in a different way. Same friends who you might have thought one way about, and then you see
Yeah,
that
yeah.
they're fine with the Holocaust, and you suddenly have a different view of them. What was that like for you, and what were the consequences of speaking out in that way?
Um, I would say it was pretty maddening, like sort of almost rage inducing. I would say, like, literally I was experiencing this genocide like a lot of us were on social media, but it interspersed with the photos of, like, dead children were people cheering it on, or people who were using what was very clearly propaganda points for Israel. So they were talking. This is November 2023. It was the first uh, sort of organized thing that I saw where they were talking about anti-Semitism at Columbia, where Columbia students had set up their encampments, and it's just like, oh, a lot of people have started talking about this at the same time.
Mm,
That's really weird. And there was a couple of things like that they would repeat each other's talking points, um, and it became clear it was a sort of an organized sort of thing that these people were participating in. And the metaphor that I made in my blog post is, the these are the prison guards, or these are the Rudolf Hess sort of the equivalent in the Nazi times, and that these are the people I work with. These are people who've invested in some cases in multiple of my companies. Um, and how is it that people who I thought were, like, decent people who've always been helpful to me, but these are people who are actually, like, advocating for a genocide?
mm. And have there been is that sort of a door that's closed for you now? You can't go back
Oh
to that
yeah, yeah.
world? Yeah, yeah,
Those
yeah.
those people are never talking to me again. I mean, the ones that I called out specifically are not talking to me again. In fact, I was doing some company stuff that recently we're shutting down the company and spinning it off, and I had to get some signatures on it, and that was a very had to get signatures from those people,
Yeah.
and one of them just told me to fuck off, and the others, um, sort of other people at the company dealt with it, and so that was easy enough, but. Um, certainly they'll never invest in me again. But honestly, when I see how much of the tech industry, and especially the venture capital startup part of the tech industry, is sort of is complicit in this genocide, it makes me a lot less interested in being part of that industry.
Hmm. I mean, I think people know about Israel's focus on tech, or at least it characterizes itself that way. It characterizes itself as this startup nation, and with a heavy
Hmm.
emphasis on getting in the tech industry. Does that sort of bleed over into the US to quite a large extent? So
Oh
anyone
yeah.
engaged in tech is caught up in Zionist ideas or Zionist financing, or
So there's a sort of a combination of things. So um, a lot of the venture capitalists are Zionists, and there's a couple of directions that they come with that. So either they grew up Zionist, and it's mostly Jewish Zionist as opposed to Christian Zionist. That's one sort of avenue. One is that there's a very big right wing part in venture capital. Um, and in particular, there's sort of the Peter Thiel section of the
Mm.
world. And
Palantir and that
there's an
kind of thing.
entire ecosystem about him around him, which is super far right. And JD Vance, who's the current vice president of the US, is one of those people. And a lot of the people who are getting involved in sort of like Doge and the what's happening in the US right now is sort of in that ecosystem. But even outside that, there's just a lot of people who are in the sort of like right wing, um, national security, America first. We're in a war with China. That sort of mentality is very prevalent. And a lot of the more influential venture capitalists, in particular, Mark Andreessen, for example, are of that mindset, and that pervades. You see a lot of very young people coming into tech, and they take on the attitudes from venture capitalists because of the sort of power dynamic, right? The VCs are the people who have all the money, who have all the followers. They're part of their job is being thought leaders, and so the young impressionable founders who are trying to figure out how to be rich, how to be successful, how to be someone that people listen to. They take their examples from venture capitalists in a lot of cases. And then the third area that you have is the actual direct connection from Israel. So there's a unit in the Israeli military called Unit 8200,
Mm.
and they are it's a very sort of like prestigious thing. It's like the top 1% of the draft gets to be in Unity 200, and from there they go to be startup founders. They go to into venture capital. They go to work in tech. It's signal intelligence. It's sort of like the spies who are they're not in the field, but they're listening to they're sort of like the NSA. They're tapping your phones and they're writing software, and so they're
Mm.
the tech part of the Israeli army. Um, and those people are very heavily represented in tech, and very often they form a startup that gets bought by an American tech company, and suddenly you have a lot of Israeli employees at these tech companies. And so that's been one major way that Israel has gotten influence into US tech, and one of the ways in particular where the um, the suppression and sort of the shadow banning that we've seen on social media has come about in part because there's so many Israeli employees in sort of key positions in social media companies, and all of these would have made their way through this sort of like was in 80 was in Unit 8200, founded a startup, got acquired, that sort of pipeline into the US tech scene. And we would see. I remember a couple of years ago, someone sent me a, oh, you should work with this guy. He's really good. He was in Unit 8200. And I was like, that's a weird thing to call out. It's really weird to say that this guy was a spy in the Israeli army, and so you should work with them.
Mm. Yeah, like this really nefarious unit responsible for being integrated into massive human rights abuses. That's something that should be admired. And there's
Right, right. And I mean, I think we can say that's true of the entire IDF, but there's a lot of evidence at the moment that the massive bombing campaign that started the genocide, and the first sort of like 30,000 people killed in those first few months was of these programs called Lavender and
mm,
Gospel, that were this is software that was built by Unit 8200, using sort of AI to scale up, the bombings essentially. So
yeah,
it is very much, that is very much literally it.
yeah. I think previous wars they said they were struggling to find enough suitable targets, and Lavender and Gospel were means to sort of scale up the target
Yeah.
bank, weren't they? And it essentially seems to be an excuse for keeping a human one step removed from making what should be a horrible decision to kill another human. You can just say, "Well, the computer told me to do it, so
Right,
that's
right, right. I mean,
murder."
it.
Yeah,
I think of it as sort of equivalent to the gas chambers, right? They
yeah,
were in Nazi Germany. They were shooting Jews in the street, and that it just wasn't the scale that they wanted for it, and so they started adding all of this automation. They started adding work camps and train lines, and they had these like tabulation machines to keep track of the whole thing that were provided by IBM, and then they had the gas chambers to do the actual killing. And then this is the same thing here, right? They had the bombs, but they needed technology to be able to scale it up. And the scaling it up is really, this was a thing that they wanted to do anyway. It was very clear that Israel's desire for revenge and killing as many Palestinians as possible. Politicians are calling it. They continue to call for that now. So all they needed to do was tweak it by you know changing the rules slightly, and this AI allowed them to change the rules to say, you know, we can just drop a bomb whenever we feel like it because the machine told us that it was okay, and it sort of like gave this veneer of I don't want to say quite respectability, but veneer of
Objectivity,
um,
maybe. Like the
I'm sorry,
computer's
say
just
again.
objectivity, maybe. Like the computer's just objectively decided there's a target there, and
Yeah, I mean, it's really a plausible deniability, right? It's
yeah.
the same way as they aren't letting aid in. Why aren't they letting aid? Oh well, we need to inspect every truck that comes in. We need to make sure there's no weapons. Oh, this baby formula can be dual use, right? So we need to make sure that we remove. We found something in this truck. The whole truck is out. Oh, there's all these settlers that are sitting in front of the gate. We can't let the trucks in because we can't. The settlers are standing there. What are we going to do? Drive over them? And it's just like it's just plausible deniability for the genocide that they wanted to do anyway.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, there is. I mean, it is like I've made the comparison to like the industrial scale and industrial approach of the
Hmm.
Nazis before. And I think the what's going on at the aid stations at the moment is very similar to that. There's a kind of metronomic rhythm to it. It's just 100 people, 80 people, 100 people. It's just a steady tick, tick,
Yeah.
tick, as if they've got a tally which they have to hit every day, and they're just steadily doing it in the same way the Nazis were steadily stuffing people into gas chambers.
Hmm.
So I don't see it as
Yeah.
any different. I mean, we hear a lot of it's a lot of aggrandizement of Israel's tech sector as well. There's a lot we hear how wonderful it is, how advanced it is. Is there any truth to that? Do you think, or is it, or
I mean,
yeah,
anything that you put
mm,
money into is going to do well. Like they've spent 20, 30 years, that 30 years probably at this point building their tech sector. Certainly by the valuations, they have a very successful tech sector. I don't think that we're just able to say, right, because these are evil people, the companies that they make aren't are pieces of shit. Um, but there are there are sort of like you do see a lot of that morality seep in. So, like, Deal, for example, has recently, which is an Israeli company, has recently been found to have been spying directly on their competitor Rippling, and their CEO even fled France, where he was living, to UAE, where there is um, complex extradition problems. Similar, you see that Wiz, which was one of the big acquisitions by Google recently, there's been accusations that their early customers came from this VC who is bribing CISOs across US tech companies who typically Israeli CISOs, so chief information security, kind of people who would buy cybersecurity
mm,
software which Israel produces. So there's definitely those sort of like ways of cheating and doing illegal things. Certainly we hear it a lot in the Israeli tech ecosystem, and combined with things like the pager attack that they do in Lebanon, the
yeah,
fact that they spy on kind of everything they do, you know we it is our opinion. I think it is a valid one that if you're using an Israeli tech company anywhere on your tech stack, you're actually making it really unsafe for your users. So it's not so much that they're not good at producing tech; it's that really it's they're good at producing sort of things that no one really should trust. A lot of data flows through the Israeli tech companies, and given the sort of zeal with which they protect Israel, um, and how they weaponize that. If you have a tech company that's a customer of an Israeli tech company, and you're sending data to them, you absolutely should not be doing that. It's not safe for your customers for you to do that.
yeah. So it's not merely a moral case for not using Israeli tech. There's actually a practical business case for not using it as well.
Right.
So that's
And
what you're
in
saying.
many cases, a legal case as well.
Yeah, oh
GDPR
yeah,
and that
yeah.
sort of thing.
And well, that was an illegal case. In terms of you're supporting a genocide, that's what the point we always make in our campaigning, that if you're involved in assisting Israel in any way, it is illegal. Is
Right,
it?
absolutely.
That's kind of
Um,
interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
Francesca Albanese came out with her report yesterday about the economy of
Yeah.
genocide, and the companies that are supporting it. And it's a I think it's a 27-page report, and each company is only given a paragraph. Just there's so many of them, but certainly they've called out a lot of companies that are sort of the jewel in the crown of the Irish tech scene, like Google, Microsoft. Um, uh, Trying to think who else is in Ireland. Amazon, of course, probably
Yeah.
the main two. It doesn't call out Meta, but it should. But I guess it was focused specifically on the genocide rather than sort of the enablement of it, which is much more where Meta would be where Meta's complicity lies.
Yeah. So I mean, your solution, of course, to all this, or the start of a solution to it, is Tech for Palestine. So do you want to just tell us a bit about what that is?
Yeah, so Tech For Palestine started just as a group of us who reached out to me after I wrote my blog post, and I just put us in a Discord, and there was 25 people at the start, and then it went to 40. And one of the things that we had in common, and the reason I brought some of these folks together was that um, we were all doing things that were in some way related to tech. So building tech projects or technical things, boycotting apps, for example, or that we were addressing a part of the tech scene, like the venture capital side of things. So we you know had 40 of us, and then we opened it up, and everything just went sort of wild from there. There's 1,000 people joined in the first week. Sorry, in the first day. Another 1,000 joined by the end of the week, which is like 3 days later. So it was just kind of going crazy. And we tried lots of things, starting new projects and putting volunteers together. And for several months, almost nothing worked. All the projects that we started were failing, were just falling over. We hadn't figured out how to make them stick, how to get volunteering. And we tried lots of things. And eventually the thing that stuck and is what Tech for Palestine is now. So we're an incubator. And what I mean by that is that we um, incubate Palestine advocacy projects. And our theory is that Israel has Zionist projects just across the ecosystem. I don't just mean the tech ecosystem, I mean across society. You go to your local school, there's someone who's trying to get this specific IRA definition of anti-Semitism get adopted by their school. And we can see it in the pressure on the Irish government, for example. There's tons of organizations that are doing that. And in the Palestine ecosystem, we have a number of organizations that are doing phenomenal work, but they're stretched so thin. So our theory is we need thousands of pro-Palestine organizations that address each sort of like niche in society, and that's what we're about. So organizations come to us, we give them support, we give them mentorship, we give them advice, we give them volunteers, we give them funding, we give them marketing and launch support and early users and mentors. So that there's just sort of a lot of resources that you need if you're an early stage project. So one recently, new social network came to us, and we've been talking forever about the need for a new social network to get away from Meta, a replacement for Instagram. And about 2 weeks ago, one came to us. It's called upscrolled.com. And we were like, this is the thing we've been waiting for. So we've been putting a lot of resources in the last couple of days into that. We've been reaching out to all the organizations that we know to tell them about it. We've been pumping it on our socials. We've been sending it to our mailing list. We've been working with the influencers that we know to try and get them put content on it. And it went from in the last couple of days, it went from something with 70 users to something I think today with about 6,000 users, and it's just been doubling the last couple of days. Um, and so that's kind of what we do. This is something that someone built, and they put a year and a half of work into it. A Palestinian Australian built it, and they needed the next step. That's what we do.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I created my account and upscrolled the other day, BDS Belfast account. It
Lovely.
does look promising. Is that an indication of the sort of scale of ambition you have for this? I mean, that's a massive project aiming to
Yeah.
rival Instagram. Is that the goal of Tech for Palestine to be at that level?
We are very much focused at really high impact, and that
Mm,
means risk taking. And is a social network going to succeed? I mean, okay, this one is a particularly high quality one, so I
mm,
think it actually might. But most of the other things that we were looking at for around social networks in particular was like, well, this is a high risk thing. We don't know if this is going to succeed. But we are very happy to take these risks because you know, typically high impact comes from looking at something that has a relatively low chance of success, but if it has success, it will like really, really have success. And a couple of them have worked really well. So Boycat,
yeah.
you should use Boycat.
Every day, yeah.
Um, that's Adil we started working with a little bit over a year ago. He was the first person in the incubator, and we provided a lot of resources that were really helpful in blowing that up. And now they have millions of users. They've diverted hundreds of millions of dollars of spend on complicit companies. And this is it is still young, right? It will grow 100 times, 1,000 times perhaps from where it is now, and so that's going to be really, really impactful in the long term.
I suppose a follow-on question to that would be, like, do you have a? I mean, it's two things. It's the sense to which you have an insight into the number of users you have and what they're doing and how that interacts with the cost of all this. Like that's obviously things like an Instagram app. There must be potentially enormous costs attached to that. If the Instagram app itself presumably has enormous storage costs for all of the photos and videos. There's probably some sort of AI involved in there, which is would be quite costly.
Hmm, hmm.
Support all that, and then it's a very useful thing to have a sense of how many customers you have and what they're doing, and which requires a
Hmm.
lot of sort of customer research. Do you have the resources to do that? I mean, how does that look for a platform like Tech for
Yeah,
Palestine?
I mean, we have the resources to do that directly? Not really. Like the grants we've been giving to these companies, for example, or I mean, they're mostly organizations are very, very small. It's like $300. I guess that's 200 and something pounds a month.
Something, yeah.
It's not very much.
Mm,
So is that enough money for a social network? No, but we are connected to to funders, to tech founders, to angel investors, all that sort of thing. And a social network is something which, as we can see with Meta and TikTok and these other very successful things, they are things that make money at scale and that people are willing to invest in. So it's something where once it starts succeeding, it is something that those resources are available in the normal way, which is hiring people who have that expertise. Um, it is certainly a challenge at this day where there's one employee, the founder of Upscrolled is kind of doing everything. We're trying
mm,
to get volunteering resources to him. We're trying to get sort of angel investors to him so he can start building a team, and he has to do that at the same time as as replying to all the customer support and that kind of thing. So I think um, certainly it's going to be a stretch, but social network in particular is something that they've been done many times before,
yeah,
and they are being done as this is being done as a company, right? It's not like our little scrappy nonprofit is trying to put together a bunch of volunteers to do it. It is something that will make money for its investors, and so there is money and resources available for that from the broader ecosystem.
yeah. I suppose if it's good enough, just the basic logic of capitalism is going to kick in. There will be somebody who says, if this is making money, then I'll invest in it.
Exactly. And we've been working with a lot of things around that. So, for example, we have Entrepreneurs for Palestine, which is a community of entrepreneurs. We also have Investors for Palestine, which is something that we're just kicking off at the moment, which is trying to build this alternative anti Zionist or at least non Zionist ecosystem of investors where ethical founders can know that they have ethical investors. So we have a handful of those investors already, and we know many more. It's just kind of getting started. That's something where we can take things that are starting to really take off, like Upscrolled, and put it in the hands of ethical investors who will probably make a lot of money by being ethical.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole generation coming through, I suppose, who will also want to use things like that if they're aware that a more
Yeah, I mean
ethical.
the
Yeah.
youth today they're so politically engaged, they're so ethically focused, and they realize that. I mean, I don't know whether capitalism, I suppose, but they realize that the generation maybe two above them has really ruined this planet for them, and they are looking all the time for how can they do things as ethically, and they take the purity quite far, which I personally agree with. Um,
Mhm.
and that is kind of a thesis of a lot of this stuff. You can build ethical companies. So boycott, you can think of it as a boycotting app where you scan your groceries, but really it's an ethical consumption company. It's how do you make sure that your life you live as ethically as you can. And they have features around that where you can go to their store and you can buy things on it, and it gives you alternatives that are more ethical. So instead of buying Coke, you buy Palestine cola, or instead of buying I can't remember what shoe brand was recently on the shit list, but there's ethical shoe brands and that kind of thing.
Mhm. And I think the activist colleagues of mine, comrades of mine, have seen the likes of boycott as being something that you can scale up beyond simply Palestine. It seems like you're moving in that direction. You have strands within boycott for boycotting American products, and I think
Hmm.
things that are harming Congo in some way as well. So there's a potential to scale that up to any cause. Is that just in terms of Tech for Palestine? Do you see it? Do you have a long term plan at the moment for it moving even beyond Palestine and being like a wider ecosystem
So
for?
we don't have a plan to become some sort of like broad tech thing, but there's
Mm,
the people, or sorry, broad like tech for good kind of thing. Like, we're very much focused on Palestine. However, we encourage our projects to. So boycott, another one, find a protest. This has come up relatively recently. So find a protest was originally how to find Palestine protests, and there was the question of do we add other protests to this, and uh, to me, the answer is like, of course we did. It makes so much sense. So for a start, you bring Palestine protests or boycotting to a new audience. So boycott, it added boycotting America. That was specifically for Canadians because Canadians were not impressed with what America was doing with the tariffs. And what that does is it brings the Palestine message to this much larger audience of Canadians who want to boycott who want to boycott America. And that's just a much larger audience. Same with the Trump protests right now; they're bigger than the Palestine protests were. And if we don't let protests for non-Palestine happen on Find a Protest, what's going to happen is that someone else is going to make a protest app, and those people who make the protest app might not want to have Palestine on it, or it might be a smaller audience. But by being the places that scale up to things like people protesting for Congo or protesting American complicity, um, or protesting Trump or whatever it is, that allows the Palestine message to be a major part of those conversations because they were started by people where Palestine was the most important thing.
mm. That's something certainly we've been conscious of recently. We were reminded of by so the BNC, the BDS National Committee. They suggested to us the importance of working with other movements because, like you say, you can bring Palestine to other people and broaden it that way, and you might find there's a lot of similarities between what they're campaigning for and what
Hmm.
you're campaigning for, and there's expertise they can bring in which you might not previously been aware of.
Yeah.
Um,
And a lot of a lot of what we're doing is we're building tools for the movement. And yeah, those tools get more usage in their movement, and there's an intersectionality, right? People who are likely to be for Black lives are likely to be for Palestinian lives, or people who are fighting for LGBTQ plus rights. They're also the same people who've been at the front lines of protests. getting arrested and all that sort of thing for Palestine. So there's certainly we can get that expertise, but also they were here for us. We have to be there for them.
Yeah, that's about building solidarity as well.
Hmm.
Um, I'm really interested in the idea of, since I use it every day, boycott. Like this, I think we spoke before the podcast about the scale of that challenge of how do you on with just one or two developers scale up to for an app which aims to categorize every product on the planet, I suppose, hopefully at one stage. How
Hmm.
is that done just in the practical terms?
Actually, I've wondered this myself. I don't know the answer.
Right.
Um, we 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 had another project that came through that actually used AI for this. So it didn't have a whole database, and it just like you would ask it, um, uh, and it would go to AI. So you would say like, are flowers, um, you know, looking for ethical flowers or whatever it is, and it would go
Yeah.
through, the knowledge in the AI,
Mm,
and it would say, yeah, flowers don't really come from Israel. You're probably fine. And that project didn't really lead anywhere. But what was interesting was that it was about 90% accurate,
right.
which is pretty decent for like we don't have a catalog of it. However, Boycat very much does have a catalog. You can add them, and a lot of that information has been around for a very long time. So, for example, the AFSC, which is the American Friends, um, uh, so American Friends are like the Quakers, right? So they've been doing divestment for 120 years, and they run investigate.info, which has all of this information going back. Like they've been putting this together for decades at this point. So a lot of that information is out there, has been compiled, um, and getting it is not terribly difficult, but also that gets you the base. But really, you want to get more than that. So in the app, you can add things, you can add alternatives, and then they get checked at the back end by the boycott team.
Yeah, so I suppose like a big crowd resource, a crowd, what's the word for it? Crowdsourced means of
Hmm.
doing it. It's just everyone who's using the app is
Yeah,
contributing to that knowledge as well.
yeah,
Uh,
and exactly. And when you scan something and it like doesn't know what it is, I don't know if it does this, but I presume it must ask you for information. What was this? What is it called? Give us a photo. That kind of thing.
yeah, no, there's like a report an error, or if it doesn't know about the app you've or the product you've scanned, it'll give you a prompt to
Hmm.
fill in more information about it. Yeah,
Yeah. Now that said, barcodes actually contain the country of origin. So even if it doesn't know, it can tell you, is it Israeli? Now, it doesn't mean that it's not a complicit company, but it can get you a large portion from the start.
yeah. But I mean, you also not just the users. I think you've talked a bit about the extent to which Tech for Palestine relies on volunteers as well. Is it 200,000 volunteers you said you had?
No, no,
Was it
like three and a half thousand.
three and a half? I don't know where I got the
Yeah,
number
yeah,
from. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
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 but that's actually our volunteer database. So the amount of volunteers that we've actually put to work is probably more in the sort of 400 or 500 range. It's rather than like most volunteers is sort of like show up at the soup kitchen kind of thing. It's a mass sort of scale. But what the kind of volunteers that we do is more get involved in the project, and also you have to have specific skills. So it's not just, are you a developer, but are you a developer that knows how to build mobile apps? Do you know the specific language that this project is built in? And you're much less useful if you don't. So that it's a lot more of a recruitment process of placing people who have sort of 10 plus hours a week, who want to take part in something long term. Um, and so we're placing sort of like handful of people a week to scale up these projects basically.
yeah. Um, and the other thing you do a lot of, I think, is you aim to employ Palestinians themselves.
So we have 4 Palestinians on staff. These are displaced from Gaza. They're in, most of them are in Cairo. Um, and so they work as engineers, or they do development work within Tech for Palestine. They work on some of the projects, that kind of thing. We plan to scale that up as well. But we have a hiring initiative that we hired them through. Um, the so engineers you can hire through apricotinternational.org, and they work with thousands of volunteer or thousands of Palestinians to get them jobs. I think at the moment they've got 45, 50 people hired, and so they're scaling that up at the moment.
Yeah. I think one of the things probably a lot of people might have learned from the recent conflict is just how well educated Palestinians are, and how well educated Gazans were. I think it was known to have one of the, if not the highest, one of the highest per capita concentrations of PhDs in Gaza.
Yeah. Also,
Um,
the literacy rate is
yeah.
astronomical. It's like 98.5 or something, which, the US is much lower than that. Ireland is much lower than that. Israel is much lower than that.
Hmm. And I've heard Palestinians talk about it, and I think it is a case of oppressed populations. They just realize that one of the ways
Right.
to get out of
I
that.
mean, one of the astonishing things for me, we support several projects in Gaza, particularly around students, and they're still in college, right? They're doing their homework every day. There's a genocide. They can barely afford, or there's barely any food, and they're completing their computer science homework. It's kind of it's absurd in a way, but it sort of shows how important education is to them.
Yeah, and just the resilience, like the sumud they talk about, just that you see like schools being held in rubble of buildings.
Yeah.
As I say, people doing their homework on a laptop in the middle of rubble in a tent, and
Yeah.
yeah, that does show an amazing resilience. And you're struck actually when you see Palestinians, where the racist narrative is of these people coming over to Palestine and making the desert bloom and bringing
Hmm.
their civilizing influence to these sort of
Right.
primitive people. But when you see Israelis, they're generally very unimpressive. The ones we see on our TV, anyway, they're like come across largely
I
as
mean, yeah,
petulant children.
right.
And of course, the Palestinians generally are much more impressive, much more calm,
Hmm.
much more intelligent people. It seems.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that sort of once the veil is lifted, you start to see like that basically that there's just straight out racism, and
Mm,
for us as well, right? We've been raised in a society which is racist against Palestinians, and that values white people better, and Israelis are white, and that's why they're in the Eurovision Song Contest, for example.
yeah,
You start to look at the Eurovision in particular, you started thinking like, what? There's all these countries in the Eurovision, like Australia is in the Eurovision. What is it about these countries that they have in common? And
yeah,
so like, oh yeah, no, we actually built a song contest for white people. It's fucking weird, right? It's
yeah,
just sort of ingrained in our society. You don't think about it when every year we all gather around to vote and to watch the Eurovision, and oh yeah, no, it's teaching us that these are the people who are like us, and the people who aren't there are the people who aren't like us.
yeah. Israel has to do this very tricky straddling act where they say, no, we're really Middle Eastern and we've been Middle Eastern for thousands of years. Oh, but also
Hmm.
we're European as well. So we can
Right, right.
compete in the Eurovision Song Contest and we compete in the European Football Championships. And it's a slightly ridiculous straddling
Yeah.
act where you try and ride two horses at the same time.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and it- as I said, once the veil is lifted, you start to get it's like, oh, they actually just moved there pretty recently with guns and displaced the local population.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, do you have a sense for like the scale of the loss there's been? I mean, you talk about the resilience of Palestinians, but obviously it can't overcome everything that's been destroyed. Do you have a sense from working with educated Palestinians, the extent to which the scholasticide there, the destruction of the education system, has the extent of that and how it's affected
I
people
mean,
there?
every university has been destroyed,
Yeah,
um, and but we talk about the resilience. Well, one of the first things that we did that we worked with was one of the West Bank universities was opening up their online education, um, to be able to support the displaced Gazans who weren't able to go in person, who maybe their professors weren't available anymore. One of the organizations that we support is a Gazan mentorship initiative, and this is a college student who's running like 15 different WhatsApp groups to get 200 students mentors, principally from outside, um, principally from outside Gaza, so mostly in the US, Egypt, and Algeria, um, to be giving mentorship to these students on all the sort of like computer science stuff that they need. And he's scaling that up, um, just through everything that's happening. And so there is absolutely immense resilience, and they're just building with whatever they have available.
Mm. Do you think that, I mean, there's Palestinians have often talked about their sense that Israelis deliberately go after educated Palestinians. Do you think there's a case for that?
So it seems to me that Israel has learned from every conflict, um, and every sort of like settler colonial experience, um, of the past, and is doing the really horrific things that whatever it can do to suppress them. Um, so their emphasis on like BDS, for example, right, because that was extremely successful um, in South Africa.
Yeah.
Um, so are they doing it? I mean, there's a history of Bangladesh, for example. They targeted all of the smart people because, or all the smart people, all the educated professional, all the leaders, right? The more you kill the leaders, the more the society struggles. And Israel, uh, has particular called out that it's doing that. So it did that with Hezbollah, it did that, tried that last week with Iran, right? It very much made it clear that it was trying to behead the Iranian military. And what happens when you do that repeatedly is that people, start to expect it, they start to build for it, and they start to be resilient around it.
Mm. Of course, they were. That was a form of miniature scholasticide in Iran
Hmm.
as well, killing all the nuclear scientists, many of whom were probably
Yeah, I mean, is
n-
is there is there any war crime that Israel won't commit? Absolutely not.
no, no. I mean, I don't know, yeah, and that is the intention with destroying hospitals as well. It's obviously to
Yeah,
not just kill
I mean,
educated.
do you remember when they dressed up as doctors to break into the hospital to assassinate someone?
Yeah, which is a
Yeah, I
war
mean,
crime.
just yeah, I
Mm.
mean, every day they just commit endless war crimes. And yeah, the Americans cover for them. It's I mean, really kind of like opens your eyes quite a lot.
Yeah. Um, you'd mentioned that Tech for Palestine, people shouldn't think of it merely as something for people with tech skills. It's something that can be applied to activist groups as well, who you wouldn't necessarily think of being tech first.
So our thing is scaling up, right? And this is fundamentally what the tech industry is about, right? It's not really about writing code. Although when you scale things up, often you are doing a lot of sort of like automation. But you think of like Uber or Instacart or something like that. It's like the grocery company, the vacation rental company, the taxi company, right? These are all tech companies.
Mm,
And it's not just massive AI search engines or apps. I mean, they're app enabled, obviously, but what principally worked about Uber was that they leveraged technology to be able to really scale, and that's how we think about things, right? We want to take things that are working, that are established, and figure out how to scale them up. So it's we take that sort of very loose definition of tech, very sort of generous, flexible definition of it. So yeah, I mean we often work with organizations that aren't necessarily a thing you would think of as tech. So for example, we work with some folks that are doing art installations because their plan is let's bring art installations to that focus on Palestinian art all around the world. How can we scale that to hundreds, thousands of these Palestinian art? It's bringing the message to people who aren't necessarily seeing it. So to us, that's a valuable thing to invest in. But from the perspective of volunteers, uh, the number one volunteer post that we have is social media, right? Projects need people to focus on social media content. These are things you don't, that's not something a coder does. That's something
mm,
where we can have non-technical volunteers that do it. Obviously, our second biggest volunteer request is coders, but our first biggest is people to do social media.
Yeah, and that I mean, I would do a lot of the social media for BDS Belfast, and that is a huge time investment to do a
Yeah.
lot of that sort of thing. So it makes sense to have dedicated people for that. I mean, what do you think? The sort of notions of in a tech company of regular iteration, measuring what you're doing, improving from there, and so on. Do you think, what extent do you think that applies to activism? In my experience, sometimes you don't have all the information you'd like to have as an activist. You don't know the internal metrics of the company or the government you're affecting. You don't know quite how you're changing their behavior. So to what extent does that sort of iteration cycle apply to
I mean,
activist
it
groups? Yeah.
applies very much, and
Mm,
it's the major thing that we discuss with all new projects.
mm,
We have our our little doc of how to do a project, and it explains, right, that it's really about iteration, experimentation, learning, and it's figuring out the metrics, figuring out things that work. Um, Certainly for are you convincing the government that that's a difficult thing to do. You have to
mm,
actually ask them, and you have to presumably get to know staffers and that sort of thing to be able to have that kind of metrics. But regardless of what it is, there's a sort of a talking to people to learn from them. We just started working on this project of like a page to convince people about Palestine, and um, it's fundamentally a research project. It's not a writing project. It's a talk to all the people who you can get your hands on that were at some point convinced, went from not knowing about Palestine to becoming convinced. What is it that convinced them? What wording convinced them? What evidence convinced them? What videos convinced them? What was it that got them across the line? And that's something that we can intuit from our own experience, but it's not, you know, our own experience is often is sort of false or unique, or
mm,
you really need to talk to people to be able to get that learning, and it is all about the learning. Like certainly iteration is a key part of it, but we talk about risk. You want to figure out what is the biggest risk. If you look back at your project in 10 years, your project failed. How did it fail? Why did it fail? What is the thing that made it fail? And you can use that to classify what are your biggest risks at the moment. So for the project that I just mentioned, well, actually, let's talk about upscrolled. Right, so upscrolled,
mm.
first biggest thing is like, can we get people on the platform? Great. So did that. We now have thousands of people on the platform. They're inviting their friends. It's growing. Great. What's the second biggest risk? Well, actually, the second biggest risk now is that people are only talking about Palestine. The entire platform is talking about Palestine, and that's not an interesting social network. So now we're
Mm,
focused on bringing on people who to talk about things that aren't Palestine, getting the people who are on it to talk about things in their lives that aren't Palestine, to talk about their art, to talk about their lives, their puppies and their children and whatever it is you talk about on social networks. So the risk changes as you go through, as you start to validate one risk, you move pretty immediately on to another risk.
mm.
And you have to experiment, learn, test things out. And the more you do that, the more you kind of listen to your audience on that, the faster you can do that iteration and the faster you can scale.
Yeah. And there's a plan. I mean, one of the things, obviously, we would love Upscroll to be successful, to get out from under the thumb of Meta, because their censorship is so strong, particularly for Palestine. What is the plan to control user content on Upscroll? Is, I mean, obviously, what another risk that occurred when you're speaking there is what if you get hate the hate? If maybe you don't want to censor Palestine stuff, but what if there's hate speech from the other direction? What if there's sort of hatred towards Palestinians
I mean, hate
yeah,
speech isn't allowed on the platform.
no,
There is a one of the things that really appealed to us about this about Upscrolled when it came to us is that it was feature complete, right? It had reporting mechanisms, it had a hate speech policy. It was like fully ready to go. Like, you could not have handed me a better thing for the movement.
mm,
Um, and so, if there's hate speech, people will get banned. Hate speech isn't allowed on the platform. And a bunch of other things, that misinformation isn't allowed on the platform. Things that are illegal it's an Australian company, so things that are illegal in Australia, such as like prescribed organizations, right? I'm not sure that Hamas would be allowed on the platform. I'd have to check the Australian list, but I presume that they have a similar list to the Americans and the British.
Mm. Yeah. One thing that occurred to me is something activists mention a lot is nobody really completely trusts any of the messaging apps we use. I mean, people
Hmm.
assume WhatsApp's off the table completely in terms of doing anything secure because it's owned by Meta. Other people will say Signal, but then there's suggestions that it was CIA was involved in some way in its
Yeah.
development, and you can't trust that. So I think the thing that would really bring people over to messaging app would be if a trusted activist, someone like yourself or
Hmm.
people you know, were to develop a secure messaging app, and then we would have a good sense from the start that it had been made by somebody who's trustworthy and not one of these corporations or governments. Is that something that's in the pipeline?
So we have in the pipeline getting people from WhatsApp to Signal. Certainly, we have heard those allegations. They're much less strong than the allegations about Meta.
Hmm.
Certainly WhatsApp is it's been used in the genocide, for example. Um, but Meta is a completely untrustworthy company. Is completely like it's a Zionist company, just straight out. You can see it in the policies that they put out, and then sort of the leadership and the statements and the who's in sort of key places. So you can just anything that's not meta will be better. Doesn't
Hmm.
matter who does it. People, some of the pushback for upscrolled that we're getting at the moment is like, did you build it with open protocols or is it open source? And no, we didn't. Um, because those are hard to do, and those would probably be an almost impossible burden to get something successful, or to build it with limited resources and also make it open source or make it on open protocols. But it is better than Meta, and by a considerable margin. And by all means, other people can try to do things in other ways. That would be great if Upscroll didn't succeed, but PixelFed, which is the sort of Mastodon version of Instagram, if that succeeded instead, that would be great. Um, so getting off those things matters the most. And I'll note that um, uh, I I was thinking about this exact sort of like messaging security kind of problem because upscrolled isn't it has messaging, right, same as Instagram you know,
Hmm.
or Twitter. They all have messaging in them, but they don't have messaging like Signal does. So it may be that right now it's just we are you can send messages, but possibly one direction that we'll go in is we'll start to adopt a lot of the Signal things, to have encrypted end-to-end messaging, that kind of thing, and maybe make it a real alternative, to Signal that is, as you say, run by people that are trusted in our community.
Yeah. And just to be clear, the thing WhatsApp describes itself as encrypted, but that we assume there's some sort of backdoor there where Meta can see
Well, no,
everything.
Meta
Yeah.
Meta has made specific choices to not encrypt various things,
Mm.
um, and it has also made choices where it knew things were vulnerable, um, and it knew that they were vulnerable specifically in the Gaza context. It chose not to fix them, and it is believed that this was used in the genocide. So. Meta is just very much worse than any other company, and taking down. We have initiatives to address WhatsApp. We have initiatives for Instagram. Um, we look at a lot of different aspects of Meta, and we do not want Meta to succeed really in any way.
Mm. So it's a bit similar to the boycotting approach we take, which is, if you're with one of the most complicit companies, it doesn't really matter so much who you go to. It's just get away from them, basically.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's really really difficult to get away from big tech. It's just a uh, they're so monopolistic or duopolistic, or whatever you want to call it. There's limited options. They're all American. They're all cozying up to the Trump administration. And I think people beyond the Palestine world, like the EU, is freaking out about this right now, and they should be, because America and Russia seem to be working together in some sort of way. Europe is caught in the middle, and all of their communications go through American companies.
Mhm. And yeah,
Kind of terrifying situation to be in.
yeah, and the point is Europe doesn't seem to have much of its own tech infrastructure either. It's either Chinese, Russian, or American, but very little
Yeah.
is sort of homegrown within Europe. Um, so just sort of finishing up here, what do you see as sort of the next stage for Tech for Palestine? And maybe just discuss anything else that you see
So
as
the
relevant.
way that we go is we build new stuff. I don't mean new projects, but new capabilities for those projects. And then we're just like completely stretched, and we then shore those up and then start some more things. So our team now is about 40, includes full-timers and volunteers, although it's I don't know 35 of them are volunteers. Um, and we are, pushing in terms of the events that we do, the content that we create, the projects that we're able to take on, and then the capabilities that we're doing for those projects. So, um, the we are very much scaling, and we will continue to scale. The latest direction that we're going in is fundraising. So we're bringing in money largely to start these projects, but also trying to bring in sort of like tech money to support the broader Palestine ecosystem, or the broader Palestine advocacy ecosystem, because that's really the part of the world that we focus on. Um, and yeah, so that's kind of one of the areas. Probably one of the more recent things we did was bring on a lot of mentors. So I had been doing a lot of the mentorship, and I was stretched pretty thin. So we brought on a lot of like experienced tech founders, experienced business people, to be able to mentor these projects. We're doing similar initiatives all the time. We're starting new things, trying to make them successful. Very focused this week on Upscrolled. um, Talked a lot about them today. But um, we're very much like looking at what capability, what opportunities are given to us. How can we scale it? How can we improve it? And each of the projects that we bring on, become leverage for other things. So Boycat is now talking about Upscrolled. Find a Protest might add a banner to their site to get people onto Upscrolled. And a lot of people start to work together, internally. So the bigger the ecosystem that we build, the more capabilities we have to push new things onto it. So it all sort of like works together. But yeah, newest thing is, or the thing that I'm probably most focused on, once I take my mind off Upscrolled next, is fundraising and bringing more money to these projects to give them more capabilities and more ability to do stuff. Ultimately, if we could get to the point where we can actually give grants to project leaders to go on this full time, that would just be so much more valuable than people doing 15, 20 hours a week in their spare time.
Yeah, certainly. Like even in Ireland, you see, anytime there's a fundraiser, people just empty their pockets basically for it. So it might be something for people watching to think about. Do you invest in this as sort of a more long term thing, because the tech is in everything we use? Activists are all
Mhm.
day on their phones, on their computers, sending emails, sending messages. So it's really integral to what we're doing. And like I say,
Yeah.
I would use on a daily basis the apps you use, and I think
Yeah,
it's
so
brilliant
so
work.
the we do two kind of fundraisings. We do high net worth individuals. So that's largely successful people in tech or successful people in business who want to give us 50K a year or plus. And then we have the online donations, which is at techforpalestine.org/donate. And really, we're focusing on sustainability. So monthly donations are what we're focusing on, and getting people to contribute. We might do some sort of membership thing, in which case we'll convert the monthly donators into members. We're sort of figuring that out at the moment.
Yeah. Well, good luck with it all, and I think it's just brilliant work. I know we're certainly going to be continuing to use the apps you developed, and we'll be on Upscrolled from today, I would say. So good luck. Thanks for speaking to us, Paul.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
Cheers.